Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Bob Scott, former co-founder of the Kansas City Fellowship and author of 3 books, the latest of which is Some Say They Blundered, Breaking My Decades of Silence on Mike Bickle, the Kansas City Prophets, and the International House of Prayer. Bob, it's good to be back and to dive deeply into all of the critical thinking that you and I do together about prophets and ancient world. And I don't know if you've seen it, but I've started spinning off these just little short videos talking about some of the things that you and I discuss in the ancient world and how that ties culturally to what we read in the Bible. And I wasn't expecting such a positive feedback initially, but it actually took off pretty well. So in my YouTube site, you'll see a playlist that has, some Bible history and some cultural history, etc. But yeah, I'm excited to get back and to talk all things prophetic.
But I actually listened or watched, I should say, the videos because you sent me the link to it. And I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. It's condensed, which is nice for people who don't have an hour or so to sit and listen and are looking for something that's a little bit shorter. Those are very informative. So I'm glad to be your muse. I was going to say, when I was running a record company, even though I was the executive, I turned out to be the band muse many times as we were on the bus traveling and having deep conversations. I would come up with these one lines. They would just sort of come out of me. And the next thing I knew is a couple weeks later, it was a lyric in a song.
Yeah. Well, and I have a few different muses, right? So Cynthia and we've been talking about some of this in Charismania. Hers more from the biblical side than the cultural, I think. Although we do go into cultural a good bit, but to critically think about it, you have to really, really dive deeply into the ancient cultures. And they're so complex that not many people are going to. And I think that's the frustration that many people have. Whenever a minister gets up and they're talking about whatever's the passage, especially from the Old Testament, they don't dive deeply into what that passage actually means based on the context of culture that it was written from. Right. And there are some ministers that go so far as to say that you have to ignore all the ancient culture. You read the text from within the text, which you can't read any book like this, man. That's not the way that life works.
I agree. I know on previous episodes, we've talked about the whole idea of perspective. And I think everybody understands the concept because anytime you're having a discussion, I think families are interesting, right? Because you can be sitting around a table during the holidays and talk about a story from the past, and the parents will have a perspective of a situation or an event that happened, right? And the kids are looking at it going, well, that's not what we remember, right? And then the oldest sibling will have a very different perspective than the younger sibling. So I think it's actually critical in critical thinking to understand perspective. Who is this person? Where do they fit into the story? What's their history, right? What is the culture they come from? How are they viewing this? Because that gives context. And I think we all have heard stories or heard phrases or things that were said, and we sort of go, huh? And the reason was we heard a statement, but we didn't understand the context because we came into the process late, right? And so we're listening to this statement going, huh? And without the context, the story where this statement or this fact comes from, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
And I came across that line of thought much further in my journey than I want to admit, because I was, like many people, I was manipulated by these guys to think that, in the ancient world, you had the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys were the children of Israel. The bad guys was everyone else on the face of the planet. That's how it was taught to me. And they said you can't read the Bible from reading the perspective of the bad guys because that's the enemy. And that's the train of thought that's sadly propagated through all of these movements. But if you're American, take the American Revolutionary War. So you've got England and you've got the people who are revolting in the United States. You view England as the bad guy if you're an American, and at that period of time, I should say. But you can't understand the story at all without understanding what's happening in England that's creating this mess that we're in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it's unfortunate when people are told that the Bible is the complete story. I mean, factually, it's probably less than 0.00001% of the story, meaning that if any of you are old enough, like our age group, we all remember Cliff Notes. If you went to college and you didn't want to read a whole novel, right, for a class, you went to the store and got the Cliff Notes, which basically were the highlights, right? The key points in the book, key phrases, key quotes, things like that. And it was a small book of less than 50 pages versus the novel that was maybe 400 pages, right? So people don't understand that the Bible is really the Cliff Notes version of 6,000 years of human history.
Yeah. I came across, you probably saw it too, but there was a comment that was made in one of the video feeds right after you made that statement. And I was watching it live. Wasn't commenting, but I was watching it live. And I saw the comments come in and they said, you can't call the Bible a Cliff Notes version. And the thought ran through my head, have you been to a library, man? That's not how libraries work.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's nothing wrong with that, but there's a reason why the Israelis are digging in their country, right? And the reason is there's a whole lot of the story that they are trying to uncover that's buried hundreds of feet underground, right? And every time they come down another layer, they find another age. And what we find out is, like, a lot of these cities are built on top of each other. There's 7 different or 8 different timelines that are all built right on top of each other. And you keep going down, 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 down. And every time you do, you get a bigger perspective, right? You get a bigger context. Who was living here, Recently, they just discovered a whole bunch of stuff in Megiddo, which is where we get the whole Armageddon thing, where the great, the supposed, big battle that's going to be at the end of the age, and they're discovering all kinds of things as they dig down. So, I'm one of these people who, even though I'm studious, and I'm an avid researcher, and I'm a history and archaeology fanatic, I look at myself and say, I'm still a child in knowledge. There is so much more understanding out there that I'm not even aware of, and we have yet to discover. So I just think it's the better posture of heart is humility. And just say, it's okay, we don't know. There's a lot of things about this story that don't make sense, or that there's confusion here. But it's disingenuous to say that the authors of the Bible and the people that are telling the story don't have a perspective that's based on culture and their understanding of religion at the time. And you see this all the way from Abraham, right, who's leaving Mesopotamia, who is in Ur, which we still today have the Temple of Ur, right? It's still there. The place where Abraham worshiped Nana, the moon god, as he moves, west, to this land of people that are settled there. And you see his understanding of God is very limited, but it's based on what he grew up with in Mesopotamia. Over the course of time, that revelation of who God is expands.
Right. I've put long, hard thoughts into exactly that. How do we get into this mess? Because, like you, whenever I hear somebody that's telling me what they know through, I love to watch documentaries, and like my YouTube, I'm sitting here watching people talk about ancient world and ancient history, etc., and religion, politics, etc. Whenever I hear somebody that comes out with this attitude that they've learned all there is to learn and now they're the expert on the subject, I usually shut it off because,
Right.
yes, I'll listen to the expert on the subject, but the best experts admit that, this is a lifetime of learning. That's why we're here. We're here to learn, to grow, to become better, to shift mankind in a good direction. And those are the people that I like to listen to. But you find some people that they really don't understand a lot of the things that they're talking about. And worse, because they present things as though it is the ultimate solution, every single person listen to them will take the mistakes that they have and count it as fact. The other thing I like about people who are honest and open is that if they don't know something, or if they're learning it, they'll say, this is what we know now. And we know this based on these facts. However, those facts may change. We may learn more as time goes on. And there's so many possibilities for things to learn that we had no clue about. That, in fact, I was just reading the news yesterday and came in my news feed. They found this, I can't remember how old, thousands of years old pyramid that's under the sea, that's basically rewriting the history in a specific region of the world because they didn't know this existed. They did not know that people here were building pyramids.
Well, it's sort of interesting to me because the past is buried, right? I mean, this is me being philosophical here, but the past is buried underground. And as we keep digging, right, we're learning more about our past. But then what's is equally interesting to me is like the James Webb, I don't even know what they call that thing. You know what I'm talking about? The big satellite, that's got, right? It's fundamentally changed massive amounts of perspectives on the universe and what's out there, right? It's so fascinating to me because I don't even know how long. I think that thing's been up there, a decade maybe?
Yeah.
I'm not even sure, but it's like every month you hear this, oh my gosh, we just, learned this and all of our theories about that are wrong. And, and so there's this constant flux in the scientific world about the universe and how we got here. And so I find all that fascinating. So I'm there. It's interesting. It's like one of the things I've figured out about humanity is we're curious about our past. We want to know where we came from, right? Which is where why the Bible becomes such a key foundation for Christians. But then to where we want to go today on prophecy, we want to know the future, right? So it's like we want to know the past because we want to know who we are and where we came from. And we want to know the future. And so one of my questions, so I'm trying not to be put you on the spot here, but one of the questions that has kind of been rattling around in my brain recently is why are people so consumed by prophecy?
Exactly.
In other words, what drives us? The reason I'm asking is because when you get into the subject of prophecy, you're stepping on very sensitive territory here. People get very emotive and emotional and highly, you get some very intense conversations, but there's something in the human soul that I want to be careful here because I did a little research and found out that only 45% of our population even believes in prophecy. So we're not talking about most people. We're talking about less than half of the people even believe that prophecy is a thing. But why is it a thing? What is it in human nature that we need to know?
I've thought long and hard on that because for me, I'm studying the cults and the history of the progression of cults. And as far back as you go, you're going to find a cult leader. You're going to find he or she turning destructive. And you're going to find the thing that attracted people to them was that they claimed that they could speak from God or speak for God, one of those two. And it goes all the way back through time. And honestly, I think that's why so many people don't believe in prophecy, because here's a bad person, they're doing bad things to people, and they claim that they're speaking on behalf of God. And you can take that all the way back literally to the Garden of Eden. People want to become more than humans. They want knowledge of good and evil, just like, the serpent tempted Eve and Adam. And they want to become more than they are. But more than that, they want the knowledge, not just of good and evil, they want the knowledge of their future and their outcomes. And so, sadly, this movement that Branham was just one cog in this massive larger wheel, they turned the word prophecy into what the ancient Hebrews called divination and fortune telling. It was predictions of the future, so they could peer into this crystal ball using the prophet's head so that they could see, okay, what's going to happen to us, good or bad. And I really never thought about that until it was probably 2 or 3 years after leaving. I was talking to some ministers, and they were talking about prophecy. I think we were at lunch or something like this, and I'd never really thought about what I believed about prophecy. But they were discussing the ancient prophecies in the Old Testament in preparation for a sermon, I'm sure. But they were talking about how the prophecies, even though they did have a future aspect to them, the majority of the prophecies that we have in the Old Testament are actually more focused on things that had happened rather than things that were going to happen. Usually, if it was a thing that was going to happen, it was because they had either kept the Mosaic law and these blessings would come because they've upheld this section of the law, or the curses that were coming, war, famine, drought, etc., because they had failed in the law. So literally it was in the past, you have failed or you have succeeded according to the Old Covenant, and so therefore your future isn't a unpredictable future. You know that you failed. You know that these curses are coming. And here God is declaring the curse that's coming according to the law. And during the course of that conversation, it just suddenly clicked that what we believed as far as prophecy wasn't really prophecy according to the Bible, but it was prophetic according to the way that the ancient pagan religions saw prophets.
Well, something that people may not realize is do a little research on the timeline of the prophetic books, right? So if you think, theoretically, based on some people's beliefs, there's 4,000 years that the Old Testament covers. Now, of course, if you start with creation and all that, it could be much longer. But, if you just start, based on certain genealogical timelines, there's at least 4,000 years there, at least, right? But the whole prophetic focus, like all these books, are written in the last eighth of that time period, right? It's the 500 years before Jesus. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Yes. So you're talking about a time period. So what was going on? So my question always is, what, it's like you don't see, prophecies, at the time of Abraham, or, very little at the time of Moses, or even, you see a little bit with Nathan, but these prophetic books that talk to the nation, right? When do they start appearing?
After the Old Covenant.
Yes, but they're appearing at a time, well, this is really interesting, where there's great turmoil in Israel, right?
Right.
The 10 tribes in the north are under attack from Assyria. They're then taken into captivity and scattered all over, the northern part of the Middle East. And then 150 years later, you have the Babylonians coming in and taking the last two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, right, back to Babylon. So what's happening is you suddenly now have a group of people who have been told that they are God's chosen, right? They've built this temple. They see themselves basically at the center of everything, like everything revolves around them, right? The nations of the world, are supposed to come worship at their temple, and suddenly it's all gone. So what you see happening is the prophets, in many cases, are trying to encourage the people. God's not done with you. This isn't over. But they're not only doing that, they're explaining why this happened. Right? So to your point, they're going back and saying, listen, you didn't obey. This covenant that God made with you was conditional on your behavior, and you didn't behave. And so therefore he took it away from you. But he's going to give it back. Right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying all this just because we don't have time to get into all the details. But so much of it, right, was about explaining the past and getting people excited about the future. So one of the things that in my question of why, because I'm thinking even in the modern world, why the people that seem so consumed with prophecy. I think there's a couple of things here. One is fear.
Absolutely.
Right? At the core of us as humans, we often feel very small and powerless when it comes to the forces of nature and creation, right? We feel like we don't have a lot of control. And I think often people find comfort or solace in prophecy, right? It's like, I need to know.
Right, and there's another aspect to this, because I've thought long and hard about this as well. Whenever Branham started preaching prophetic in the latter rain movements, in front of all of these people, some of whom read their Bibles, and I'm surprised that nobody called him out on this, he divided the 7 churches of Asia Minor in the book of Revelation into 7 church ages, which was dispensationalism, so that he could be the king of his dispensation. That was the strategy. But when he did this, he said, God only sends one prophet per age. And he walks you through the timeline of the Bible. And, I believed it. Even long after leaving, I never thought to question, was that even true? But he would say, in this age, we have me, your high priest prophet. And then he would walk you back through all of the ones. And when he's preaching the Old Testament, he's talking about the great prophet Abraham. And there's nowhere, at least to my knowledge, there's no prophecy of Abraham in the Bible. And so I started scratching my head thinking about that. And then I started thinking about the fall of the temple, the Babylonian invasion. That's the point at which I was reading, and it hit me like a brick wall. I'm reading, and it says, in the days of King Darius, from Prophet A. And I'm reading Prophet B, and it starts out, in the days of King Darius. And I'm like, wait a minute, these two prophets are in the same age. How does that work? Right. Wow. So my worldview just exploded at that point. I realized that he was manipulating us. But in that came an even greater understanding for me. So you have this explosion of prophets, Zechariah, all of the, the people. There's a list of them actually on my website if you type in prophet, and their timeline of prophecy. There's this explosion of prophets right there after the Babylonian invasion, just like you said. But think about what happened. Culturally, prophets did not operate like they do today. The prophets of old didn't get out on stage and say, pass the tithe baskets and give me your money. And, oh, by the way, this prophecy that I had weeks ago, months ago, a year ago, just happened to be fulfilled. And the audience says, well, which prophecy is that? You never told us. That's right. I never told you. I prophesied a year ago that yada, yada, yada. Yeah. It wasn't like that in the ancient world. The prophets wrote it down themselves, which I think was not quite common, or they had scribes that would write it down for them onto the scrolls. And so they would carry the scrolls, and this is literally your means to prove that God actually spoke through you, because here's the thing that was written beforehand, and here's what happened. This is the prophecy. But when Babylon invaded the temple and burned everything in it, brought it down to rubble, think of what was held in there, all of the prophecies. So what we have left, and the reason it seems like an explosion, is because the people who were there after all of this was burned and destroyed, we have some of what remains of their prophecies. Anything that happened before, we don't. And that's the other aspect of learning how culture works and how to apply culture to the Bible. From Adam until the Babylonian invasion, I'm certain that you had a heck of a lot more prophecies and prophets, but we don't have access to that because most of it was destroyed.
Well, again, perspective is always interesting to me, right? Because as we've been talking about, but I find it fascinating because when you read the books that are written by this priestly sect, the temple is everything, right? It is the center of Jewish culture. And yet we get to a time period where somebody goes into the temple and it seems like it hasn't been used in decades, and they find an old scroll and open it up and go, "What's this?"
Yeah.
And a lot of people have speculated it was Deuteronomy, right? Which was, the whole thing. But I'm just saying it's sort of interesting because there's these little clues, sometimes that are in one or two verses that if you're not looking for it, you don't see it. But you're going, wait a minute, they don't even know what this is.
Right.
Like if the temple was such a big deal, right? And it was this 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365-day a year, functioning, center of Jewish culture. Why is it they don't? It's like they're going into the temple and it's all dusty and they find old scrolls that they don't even know what they mean. I mean, that would mean these are generations, right? If you don't know what this isn't a couple years. This is generations of we've forgotten. So I'm just saying, I think there's some things in here that we got to be really, really careful of. But, continue on with this whole thing about prophecy. One thing that's fascinating to me is that the whole concept of prophecy, as we've been talking about, was a common everyday occurrence in the ancient world, right? It's like every culture had prophets and prophetesses. Every leader had a council of people that functioned in some sort of foretelling, some sort of, claiming that they're speaking on behalf of the gods. This was common, right? What seems to have happened, because now we're down to only like 45% of the culture even, will embrace prophecy. Well, a lot of, I think, what happened was the whole, what's interesting about the 1500s is we have the Reformation, right? We have Martin Luther. There's a religious Reformation. But what comes along with the religious Reformation is this quest to discover God, right? We have all these prophecies, we have these books about who God is, but suddenly now there's a whole group of men who want to understand God through creation. So they began doing experiments, and we end up having the development of science, right? We have Mendelssohn playing with plants, right? We've got Galileo and Copernicus looking at the universe. We've got, later you end up with guys like Isaac Newton, right? Discovering gravity and all these things. These are all really godly guys. These are all men who are on a search for understanding God. These aren't atheists, agnostics. These are not people who hate God. They actually love God with a passion. They're trying to understand him. But what seems to have happened is, and then we talked about this even a few weeks ago about, when Van Leeuwenhoek discovered bacteria, right, in the 1500s. Suddenly there's this whole world that opens up to everyone that, oh my God, there's a microorganism world of bacteria and viruses and DNA and genetics. And all this time we thought that spirits and God and the capricious gods were controlling everything. And now we're discovering that there's this whole unseen world that's controlling things as well. right? So we've been through this shift, right? And so it's curious to me because we went through this whole shift, and now we're back here and we're in 2025, and there's still this fascination with the prophetic, right? So people kind of put some context to this. Everything that's going on right now, whether it's the fall of IHOP, whether it's the exposure at Morning Star, if it's Daystar, like there's this litany of ministries that have all sort of been exposed right now. And there's this pain, there's this disillusionment, right? That's kind of entered into a certain segment of the Christian community. Well, everything you're feeling right now, if you're a part of those groups or you're disillusioned, is exactly what the Jewish people were feeling as they were being led away in exile to Assyria, and they were being led away in exile into Babylon. And so in many ways, right now we're in a cultural situation where we have a lot of Christian exiles. There's tens of thousands of people right now that feel exiled, right? They had all these prophecies about what this person, right? And the thing that all of these ministries have in common was they had a persona, right? They had a star. They had a personality that attracted people, and the whole ministry was centered around.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. You were talking earlier about the James Webb telescope and how it's mapping out things that we never thought that we would know and understand. And it's fascinating to me in many ways, and I'm probably going to go a million different tangents, but I was studying just the universe in general. How vast is this, and what did they know back in the 50s during the latter rain versus what do we know now? And in the latter rain, there was this weird doctrine that went out that if an angel were to start flying to Mars, it would take them 1 million light years to get there, because they had no concept of distance. And that people actually believe that nonsense, and now we have a rover up there on Mars, right? But whenever I started discovering what they have learned now, I was listening to, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was explaining, we know the distance from the Earth to the moon. We can calculate this without even going there, because we have a constant, which is the speed of light. When the light hits the moon, we know exactly how long it's going to take to get to us, and that is constant. It's a mathematical constant in the universe. And he went on to say something that I'd never thought about. These stars that we see in the sky, by the time the light travels at that constant from the star, which is it's like a sun in another galaxy, and it travels all through the galaxy and hits our eyes. By the time it has hit our eyes, so much time has passed because of that distance, which is constant, that the star itself has probably burnt out at that point. The stars only last so long. The gases only last so long. And I never really thought about that. The universe as we see it doesn't even exist when you look out there, because most of it has already died and passed.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It's mind-boggling. And yet the scientific theory, as people are trying to test and learn, and you create a theory. It's a supposition. It's not like you're saying, here's the answer. Here's my theory. Now let's go try to prove it. And you usually prove it in the opposite direction. Let's prove that my theory isn't correct. And so this creates a huge problem in the religious world, because you have, not just in the NAR today or charismatic, latter rain, Pentecostal leaders, these people who are controlling the narratives, they don't like science, because if they have made any statements that science can disprove, then now science is their enemy. And this,
right,
time and time again throughout history, you can see this happening. But I came to understand that, like you said, many of the people who, some of them were executed for their scientific theories. They were good Christian men and women. Yeah. They believed it. They just wanted to understand the world that we live in. And I came to understand that even when you're reading the Bible, you're reading it through the eyes of somebody in their perspective and in their worldview, which may not at all match the worldview we have today. And many of the things that we read, to them, it might not have even been that important, that single phrase, whatever it was. It was just part of the narrative that they're trying to get you to understand a concept. And that was really difficult for me to learn and understand, because there were phrases that are meant for us to learn a concept from the Bible, but there are also phrases in the Bible that are, the sole purpose is to support the phrase that they want you to learn, and they write it from their worldview. That, it took me forever to understand that, because we were taught this notion that every word was exactly penned by God and 100% perfect, and the thought hit me. Again, I think I was in, maybe even with the same group of ministers, had this discussion during a lunch, but they were talking, there's different genres in the Bible. Some of the things in the Old Covenant, for example, is how not to get mold in your hut. And you can't really say that God wanted us in today's world to divinely understand how not to get mold in the hut of an ancient world. But it was for the concept of, try to live clean, the greater concept. So there's a lot to be learned if you can understand that people, as time progresses, people also progress.
Well, I have all the answers for you.
Really?
Yeah.
Beyond the curtain of time.
There you go, brother. Everything you need to know is right in here.
For the audience who's in the audio-only feeds, he's holding up William Branham with this photograph that says "Beyond the Curtain of Time," which is one of Branham's most famous alleged visions. He apparently peered into the underworld and saw the souls before they were to make it to heaven.
As you know, my favorite word is why. I need to understand why. And so I'm very curious about the why in the human soul behind prophecy, right? I understand a lot of it in the ancient world because people felt totally out of control, right? That's why it's interesting, because the gods are all given human attributes. And the phrase that you hear always about the gods were they were capricious. In other words, they get mad, they throw fits, they have jealousy, right? So we gave all of the gods these human attributes. It's one of the things, I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but I might as well just go ahead and say it. I think the Bible has a limited perspective on God.
Wow. You're going to kill me in the comment feeds, man.
Well, and here's why I'm trying to explain this, is that you're talking about the God of creation. You're talking about a being who spun worlds, right? Who's so much bigger than anything that a human can even imagine. The Bible is the best we can do, right? It's everything that's written is written through a human that has limitations. There's no way that God can unload all of who he is into a human being. Even in the Old Testament, when an angel showed up, everybody was peeing in their pants. They were so terrified. Can you imagine the creator of the universe I just and the reason I say that is it's again, it's about having a teachable spirit and realizing that, you know what, as much as I know, I probably don't know most things. Because I think death is going to be an absolute mind-blowing experience when we get outside of the physical world, right? Because everything we see, hear, and know about God is all based on our physical world. And I think once we die and get outside of this physical world, we're going to realize that we had a puny God. Like, he is so much greater than we could have ever imagined. In fact, to put this in perspective, 95% of all human knowledge has happened in the last 100 years. So, I mean, put that into perspective. That's something, again, people don't really get a perspective on this. So the reason why this is all important is, if you realize, I think that's part of the reason why there's less and less interest in prophecy, because I think that with more knowledge of our created world, our scientific world, right? There's been a tail off in terms, because I think in the ancient world, it's like everyone's consumed with it. It's like the norm in everybody's daily life, right? Is because they don't know what's going on.
Exactly.
That same fear, right? That need to know what's going on has stayed even in our modern world. And I think so much of prophecy, or the need that we have to hear prophecies, is based on this fear of what we don't know, this need to, we don't like surprises, right? So we kind of want to know what the future is. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it, honestly, is faith, right? People want to know what to believe in, right? They want to have faith for something. I think those are all really important things. But something, again, another weird dynamic I've noticed about prophecy is, if you look at the scale, or are you looking at the whole thing, that there's two groups of people that have way more interest in prophecy than the third group. And it's the rich and the poor. This is me observing, researching, looking at this, over the last, few hundred years of prophecy. And what's fascinating is, when you go to Africa or you go to third world countries, all of these preachers are prophesying to the poor, because the poor need hope, right? They're looking for faith, and they're so vulnerable. And it really gets me. How do you want my dander up? Is that like a really old phrase? No, because I have a passion for poor people. And the thing I hate is watching them being taken advantage of. And you could go to Africa. And I'm just not picking on Africa, but it's so prevalent there that the wealthiest preachers are all guys who stand up and claim they're prophesying to the crowd. They're speaking for God. And the poor, who have nothing, are all giving them what little bit they have in hopes for that miracle, right? Doesn't that remind you of the whole latter rain tent revival, right? All these poor people, right, giving what little bit they had in hopes that God will intervene, right? So that's half the equation. The other thing, which I learned from Paul Cain, well, I first discovered it with Nancy Reagan. I don't know if you remember this, but Nancy Reagan used to have a seer come into the White House all the time.
Wow.
Go back into it. Was kind of interesting. I remember it was really kind of controversial, because they were supposedly this, Judeo-Christian culture. But she'd have these little seances, right? She'd have what do they call those? The psychics. That's what the word I was looking for. She'd have this psychic come in, and they would do readings, right? So this really fascinated me. So I asked Paul Cain about it. And he said to me, "Oh, Hollywood and that whole political world, the wealthy people, they all want access to it."
Oh, yeah.
He goes, "If I wanted to sell my soul," he goes, "I could have been wealthy many times over." He goes, "I had so many high profile business people, Hollywood people, you know what I mean, that all wanted access, to this secret knowledge." And that opened my eyes to a whole nother world, right? Where this ties back in, of course, is you get into Amy Semple McPherson. You see what I'm talking about? Right in the middle of this very interesting time. She's there, and she's the biggest drama queen there is. As a matter of fact, just for the fun of it, you see that clarinet sitting behind me? It was played at Angelus Temple.
Oh, wow.
But you know who owned it? Nellie Quinn, Anthony Quinn's mom. And she played in the orchestra there at the temple. And so Anthony Quinn grew up there. Like, he was a part of the orchestra when he started playing real young. But their whole family was involved with her thing. And then he gave it to Paul, and Paul gave it to me as a thank you for helping him move back in the 1980s. But I've actually gone and done some research on it, and it's got a serial number that's so old that it predates 1910. He tried to claim that it was played at Azusa Street. I am not convinced of that at this point, because there's no records. It's got a number on it that's basically B189, which is just really early. You know, it's a Bundy. It's basically it's out of Paris. It's wood. It's like ebony. I let John Wimber play it, and he couldn't play it because he said the fingering on it is so old. I guess clarinets have gone through 3 different renditions, and this one's the second rendition. All these Hollywood people, prophecy, you know, that whole world. And so I'm just fascinated by how you have these two sides of the economic, you know, spectrum, the wealthy and the poor, who have an above average interest in prophecy.
Going back to another thing you said, so, and also because you've already blown up the comment feeds with all, you know, people who will hate you for whatever it was that you said before, I'm going to blow it up even further because I have a Catholic friend. Mm-hmm. And I can just say that, and everybody's going to drop off right now. They won't continue listening because this movement was so anti-Catholic. It's unbelievable. But it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that there are good Christian people in Catholic churches, and they believe differently than us. I'm not in agreement with the Catholic Church in many ways, as my friend is not. But here's where it gets really interesting. So the NAR today, they have merged this political union and alliance that's much like we had with the Catholic Church, where the priests were in bed with the government. And they were like the dynamic that you just described, keeping the poor people poor. They were introducing a lot of legalistic, man-made rules and dogmas to establish this and maintain it. Martin Luther came and he basically said, no, we're not doing this. It's by Scripture alone. By Scripture alone. And his position was not to exclude everybody from looking outside of Scripture and looking at culture and science and understanding. It was literally, these guys have bad doctrine that's not in the Bible. We don't want it. We just want the doctrines that are in the Bible. And that started the Protestant Reformation. Well, I was having a conversation with my Catholic friend, and he said, John, a thing for you to understand as you're going through your development, he understands like I do that it's a lifetime of learning. He said that Reformation, while it may have been good, there are extremes with it. So people today have taken the sola scriptura extreme, that literally meant that you have to learn Scripture by Scripture, only by Scripture, understand it only by Scripture, and you can't look outside the Bible. And that's turned into Christian extremism. What's interesting, and he didn't say this, but I'm going to say it. What's interesting is as it has progressed towards that Christian extremism, it has digressed back to very similar to what Martin Luther stood against in the world today. You have these political leaders who are in, Nancy Reagan may have had her mystics, but look at what we have today. You've got these NAR guys that are just right in bed with the political elite. You've got a whole political structure called the family, this I think it's called the Fellowship International. That's in connecting politicians to religious leaders and helping cover up a wide array of sins, just like the Catholic Church had. So we basically have digressed back to what Martin Luther stood against when we created the Protestant Reformation. And where that gets interesting and ties to this whole conversation we're having about prophecy, those specific leaders do not want people to go outside of that sola scriptura extremism, because anything that they find as the world progresses and knowledge progresses that defies what they have said about this concept that they're teaching, it disproves them, and it makes their whole establishment fall and crumble. So they will cut you off if you try to go outside of just simply look at the Bible, only look at the Bible, put these blinders on your eyes where you can't see anything else. And oh, by the way, I'm going to, just like the Pope, I'm going to dictate what you read from it.
Well, to contextualize my comments about the Bible, and I've shared this before, it's 15 centuries after the last book in the Bible is written before humanity even is aware that there's a microorganism world. And so that's my point. My point is nobody in the Bible has a revelation of the Creator and this whole segment of his creation, right, which controls so much of our modern world. They don't know anything about this. They don't know. Right. And so it's though it's not me slamming them, it's just contextualizing this to realize where there's certain aspects of this that that humanity's understanding of our Creator and who he is and what he's done is way beyond any of the Bible authors. It's not good or bad. It just is. And so you just have to factor that in there. I mean, if you think about how much in our modern world now centers around the unseen world of microorganisms, DNA, genetics, right? It's just every day you're reading about it. I mean, our whole medical structure, right? Psychology, all of it is all based on something that didn't even began to be discovered until 15 centuries after the Bible's last words were written. So that's my point and what happens in another 1500 years? What will humanity understand then? You know what I mean, about our Creator? And we've got a chance to get off our little planet and go out there into this universe, that the futurists all dream about. So I just think we have to, to realize that God is, the God that Abraham understood, or I should say, Abraham's understanding of God was significantly less than maybe a King David's version of him, right? Because the understanding of God grew over time, and that's my point in all this. So. I want to be careful here because I don't want people to misinterpret my comments.
Well, definitely they will, but there's a lot to think about here, and there's a lot to really. It's not a concept that you're going to learn immediately if you've been manipulated by one of these groups. It took me 7-8 years before I could even think that way, because they have so indoctrinated you with this fear of critical thought. And to apply critical thought to the Bible especially, for a lot of people that have been in these religions and are escaping, it's the situation where you're literally looking between heaven and hell, and you're walking down that tightrope between the two. So a lot to think about. One of the
things, I got two concerns. One, I still see this on social media where we've got ministries right now that are positioning their their ministry, the public's perception of them as being someone who speaks, or who God speaks to specially, and they have special inside information. So even with everything that's gone on, that's still there. And that concerns me because I think for both of us, what we've seen is hundreds of years of people being manipulated by that, right? People standing up saying, I have this special revelation, follow me, support me. I will lead you to the promised land. I have understanding, others don't, right? And they build a whole ministry and money-making operation based on their secret knowledge. And this isn't new. It started, as we've talked a few weeks back about the whole time period between when Jesus left and, the Council of Nicaea, where you have all these people all claiming that they have inside information and they know, who God is and what God's saying. So that's one whole aspect of this thing. I'm just concerned, and I think this whole prophetic thing is upside down. It should be a tool to serve others, and it's become a sensational media manipulation. You see what I mean? And it's interesting because every time I hear it, it always focuses on reinforcing how special that person is. You see, and the reason why this is important to me, because motive, what's underneath this thing, I think is important. And whenever I see, guys standing on a stage who are using prophecy, right, to reinforce their special place in God's purpose, I just get a yuck inside. Like there's something inside of me that goes, this is illegal. This is manipulative. This is using a gift in the wrong way, right? It's all about me, right? It's all about turning the attention to me. I don't want to say too much, but I think Paul said we all can prophesy. And so I believe I can. But when I do it when no one's around, one-on-one, with people. I think I've shared this with you before. I've stood in the grocery store. I'm checking out. I suddenly get this thing, this download in my spirit about the cashier, and it just say something as sweet as, I know things are tough right now at home, but God's got your back on this. He's going to get you through all this. And then you see the tears coming down, right? Just me and her, this word of life for that moment and gone. And that woman, has now got something to hang on to get her through. I think that's what it's about. It's about encouragement and exhortation. And it really needs to be done more on a personal level in an encouraging way versus standing on a stage and going, hey, look at me. It's all about me, Put your money in the plate.
Well, your way is a lot better than mine, man. Usually when I prophesy, it's about the Kansas City Chiefs, and as happened in the last Super Bowl, I totally missed it. But so much to think about. Thank you so much for doing this.
I just, like I've said to you before, there's, disillusionment. It's a hard thing to walk through, but sometimes it brings us back to gut check time, and we can kind of look at all this stuff and go, what is this really?
Yeah.
And I think right now there's a lot of hurting people out there, and I hope we're encouraging the people. That's really what I hope the takeaway is from our dialogues, even though we sort of get into some kind of wild stuff.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think there are people that will understand what we're saying. There will be people who don't, but that usually happens in my podcast, so I'm okay with it. But yeah, so this is fun, a lot to think about. Hopefully people can reflect and maybe grow a little bit on the inside. Thank you for doing this. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.